Jails often function as de facto mental health institutions for some people. Well, that is a striking, honestly, kind of unsettling observation from Georgia's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. But it's the reality we're looking at. For so many people caught up in the system, tragically, getting locked in a cell is literally their very first structured contact with a mental health professional, especially if they've completely slipped through the cracks in their own communities. So, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive right in and demystify a massive, really complicated puzzle: how Georgia handles the intersection of criminal justice and behavioral health. This isn't just a simple story of locking people up and throwing away the key. It's an incredibly intricate web of screening, crisis response, and, believe it or not, continuous clinical care. To make sense of all this, we're going to track the chronological journey of an individual moving through the system. We'll hit the revolving jail door, go inside the county jails, check out the tiered care and state prisons, look at the funding and future policies, dig into the persistent challenges, and finally, talk about reentry. All right, let's start at the very beginning. Section 1, the revolving jail door and the ongoing crisis of repeated bookings. The revolving jail door describes a pretty heartbreaking pattern. Think about it for a second. Custody alone doesn't magically solve a behavioral health crisis. The data, and honestly, anyone working in the justice system will tell you the exact same thing. Without actual, continuous treatment, a person's underlying issues are just going to lead them right back to that exact same jail cell. It's this brutal loop that is incredibly difficult to break. And that loop almost always starts right here in Section 2, inside Georgia's county jails, the crucial first point of contact. You really have to see the stark contrast between these two environments, because incarceration means two wildly different things depending on exactly where you're sitting. On one hand, county jails are the chaotic front lines. They're taking people directly from an arrest, usually with zero formal diagnoses, handling really brief stays and a totally unpredictable intake process. But on the other hand, state prisons are a completely different world. We're talking highly structured, long-term care with tiered treatment plans. Because county jails are the front door, the vibe there is basically medical triage. Stays are super brief, everything is unpredictable, so the absolute number one focus? Immediate safety. Staff are rapidly running suicide screenings, intervening in active crises, and just desperately trying to keep people's medications continuous. The hardest part isn't necessarily figuring out what's wrong, it's just keeping care going long enough to make a dent before the person is suddenly transferred or released. Now, if a person actually gets sentenced, the whole environment shifts. That brings us to Section 3, state prisons, where they enter a system of tiered care and structured treatment. Let's walk through this formal pipeline together. So after the arrest and the time doing triage in the county jail, an inmate is transferred to a state prison. But they don't just toss them into a cell and call it a day. First, they go through a really comprehensive reception screening to map out their medical, dental, and mental health needs in detail. And that screening? That's what decides their assignment into a specific tier of care. This mapping process is huge because, as we all know, mental health treatment isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. The state applies different levels of care based entirely on clinical need. Some folks just need outpatient stuff, regular counseling, making sure they take their meds, but if needs escalate, the system scales right up with them. They go up to inpatient moderate support, then intensive psychiatric intervention, all the way up to crisis stabilization for those urgent short-term emergencies. It's a highly formalized structure driven by licensed pros. And very often, these tiers have to tackle some pretty complex, overlapping stuff. Georgia uses what's called integrated dual diagnosis care. That means they are treating mental illness and substance use disorders at the exact same time. Why is that absolutely crucial? Well, in a correctional setting, if you try to treat one while totally ignoring the other, you're severely limiting their progress. Plus, you're massively spiking the risk of a relapse or a major disciplinary problem down the road. Now, here's a policy detail you really need to keep in mind. Georgia has specific rules ensuring that inmates are not charged for this mental health treatment while they're in a correctional setting. This completely removes the financial barrier for a population that, let's be honest, usually has zero ability to pay. And this matters to all of us. Inside a prison setting, an untreated severe illness isn't just a personal health concern. It becomes a massive, unpredictable safety risk for both the staff and the other inmates. To get ahead of those risks, the state has to open its wallet. That brings us to Section 4, funding and future policies, and investing in structured capacity. Keep your eyes on the fiscal year 2026 budget because it's shaping up to be a real game changer here. Georgia's correctional system is finally treating mental health care as a core, foundational operational issue, not just some optional side service, and they are putting real state dollars behind it to back that up. We're seeing some genuine policy momentum. There's ongoing investment in staffing to actually deliver this treatment. They've just created a brand new dedicated statewide mental health director role to oversee everything. State leaders are even in talks right now about building an entirely new, major mental health facility. The big picture goal is crystal clear: reduce the crushing, frankly unfair pressure on local county jails, which have basically been acting as default treatment centers for way too long. But hey, let's be real for a second. Despite all this momentum, we have to look at Section 5, persistent systemic challenges, and the actual roadblocks standing in the way of care. Good policies and bigger budgets are awesome, but the justice system is juggling some insanely difficult variables. Short jail stays constantly interrupt proper diagnoses. When people are transferred between facilities, you see disastrous lapses in their medication. Staffing shortages, which are everywhere right now, continue to bottleneck access to timely psychiatric care. And at the end of the day, people with severe illnesses often require much more intensive, specialized community treatment than a jail is even physically built to provide. Which leads us directly into our final and maybe most critical phase of all, Section 6, reentry and breaking the cycle as individuals transition back to the community. Picture this: the exact moment the cell door opens. Mental health treatment on the inside is only half the battle. Reentry planning is, quite literally, the difference between someone finding their footing or catching another charge. If you discharge someone without the right support network ready to catch them, you can instantly and disastrously undo months or even years of hard-won clinical progress they made while they were in custody. So to actually build a foundation for success, Georgia's Reentry and Cognitive Programming Unit laser focuses on continuous care. If we want to jam a wedge in that revolving door, an individual absolutely needs 4 essentials the second they are released: a solid supply of their medication, scheduled appointments with community providers that are already on the books, secured housing, and this one's huge, actual transportation access to get to those appointments. Which brings us to the core dilemma at the absolute heart of this whole explainer. We've seen the chaotic, frantic triage of county jails. We've explored the highly structured, tiered approach of state prisons. And we've looked at the intense vulnerability of reentry. Here in Georgia, the policy is absolutely shifting toward better care, but the success of that implementation relies almost entirely on what happens out in the real world. So I'll leave you with this to think about. Can custody-based treatment ever truly succeed if it isn't seamlessly paired with robust community care?